All right. Our big Bible story today is the story that is familiar. Most of these are, or all of these are, David and Goliath. I was wondering how to read the story. There's a lot of verses in chapter 17. So we're going to read just a chunk of the story, and I'm going to trust that this one's familiar enough that you'll remember some of the other details along the way. But this section here really gets at the heart of how David points us ahead to Jesus Christ. So we'll read from verse 31 to 58. Maybe just quick to get us right up to this point. Goliath has been coming out. He's been boasting. He's been trash talking really against God's army. Saul is cowering in his tent. David is talking about going out to meet him. And we pick up the story at the point where David has tried on the armor of Saul, said doesn't fit, and is getting ready to go out. All right. Here we go. Verse 31. What David said, well, actually, he hasn't tried on the armor of Saul. That's coming, okay. What David said, that is to the other troops, to his brothers and so forth, what he said about defeating Goliath was heard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You're not able to go out and fight this Philistine, and you are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and bronze helmet on his head, and David fastened his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, and then put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran, stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath after he had killed him. He cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaharim road to Gath and Ekron. Then the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistines, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The story of David and Goliath is a story that requires us, to hold two perspectives in tension with one another as we read it. It's a little bit like this. I've asked Mike to help prepare a slide to help us kind of visualize the story of David and Goliath. This is known as Reuben's vase. You're probably familiar with it. The first thing you see, or the first thing I see, is in the center that black vase shape in the center of the story. But when you shift your perspective, you know how this goes, you'll see the white faces on either side of that vase staring at one another across the gap. One picture, two images, depending on your perspective. The story of David and Goliath is a little bit like that. There is one story here, but two perspectives, two images, if you will, depending on your perspective. So we'll take those two perspectives in order. The first one is the perspective that we're all used to. This is the perspective of the story of David, who is an underdog. And this underdog shepherd is on his ascent to become the king of Israel. This is the story that introduces us to David, who will become, he'll become the king. He'll become this warrior king, but we will see that this warrior king is flawed already in this story. David is the underdog. We know this because of how Goliath is portrayed. We didn't read that part of the story. Goliath, all 9 feet of him is covered in armor from head to toe. It's described to us in great detail. Of course, the only portion of Goliath that is not covered is his face. Not only is he covered in armor, but his armor is described as the height of military technology. His breastplate weighs 126 pounds. The tip of his spear weighs 15 pounds. Goliath is pictured for us in this story as, military invincibility. In contrast to that, we have David. David, right? He forsakes the armor of Saul. There's some details there that we won't be able to go into. Well, maybe just this caveat. Remember King Saul? He was Israel's giant. When God selected him, he was head and shoulders above the rest, right? He has this armor. David forsakes it. We have in this story as well the decline of Israel's giant, King Saul. Enough about that. Back to David. David is pictured as vulnerable, dressed as a shepherd, shepherd's bag, staff in one hand, sling in the other, 5 stones in his pouch. Not only that, but he is the youngest of 8 sons, we know. He gets the worst job, the worst chores on the family ranch, that is guarding the sheep, ferrying food back and forth from his father's house out to the battlefront. And then when he gets there, his oldest brother, Eliab, treats him with disdain and he discards him. David is a picture of rustic vulnerability. We know this story. It's a story of David trusting in God to defeat his enemies. I discovered something this week, though. David is not as vulnerable as he is portrayed. 3 ways David is portrayed as a lethal killer. First, he says so with his own mouth. He says, I have killed a lion and a bear. And he has. By his own testimony, David is a killer. Second, a sling is a lethal weapon when you read it in the context of the Bible. Now, in my mind, David is out in the field, out in the wilderness. He's plunking away at targets because he's so bored watching those sheep that belong to his father. Right? A little bit like, plinking away at empty tin cans with a BB gun. That's how I always thought of David. But in Judges chapter 20, go read this story on your own. I don't have enough time to describe it. But here's the crucial part. The tribe of Benjamin has 26,000 troops. 26,000. They are coming against an army of 100,000. They're outnumbered 4-1. Except that they have 700 special forces. These special forces are select troops who are left-handed. That's a fun little detail. Select troops who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. In the story, the tribe of Benjamin, this little bitty tribe, repels troops 100,000 strong, time after time after time. Why? Because their special forces are able to kill people from a distance. The sling makes one a sharpshooter. It's the ancient equivalent of a sharpshooter. David is lethal. He is deadly by his own testimony, I've killed, and by his weapons. And then the third thing. David ends this story armed to the teeth. He begins saying to Goliath, I come at you in the name of the Lord, not you come at me with sword and spear. It's emphasized throughout the story, and yet what happens? At the first opportunity, David grasps the weapons of his enemy in order to cut off the head of Goliath. And he's still holding the weapon as he comes before Saul. He holds on to the weapons of his enemies and puts them in his own tent. David is a killer in this story. When we look at the story of David and Goliath, we see David facing off, this underdog killer, facing off against Goliath, his adversary, the giant. This story of David and Goliath, as I've said, is the introduction to David, who will become Israel's warrior king. These details provided for us by the writer reveal to us that David, who is a man after God's heart, will end up being the king whose hands are so bloodied by war, by adultery with Bathsheba, and by the murder of Uriah, one of his elite troops, that David is unfit and prohibited from building the temple of God. David is introduced as, well, Israel's broken warrior king. That's the story from one perspective. When we shift perspective on this story, we have to focus on the speeches, on the words that are spoken. And when we listen to what is being said and we pay attention to Goliath, you know what we hear. We hear lies, right, spoken. Goliath sets himself up as the hero in this story, as the hero for the Philistines. And as such, he promises his people that he will be able to save them from anything. Just put him out front. But there was never any intention, we know by their actions, of actually submitting themselves to the Israelites if he were to be defeated. Goliath is that boastful, prideful, grasper of power. He represents the powers of this world. And we have seen Goliath repeated throughout history. I think the writer gives us only a snippet of Goliath's speech. It's very short, if you'll notice, because he doesn't want to subject us over much to his lies and his curses. In contrast to that, we have the words of David. And what does David say? David speaks a prophetic word about how God saves his people, not with sword and spear. It's not salvation by the way of the world, through military might. God wins the victory, not for a single group, but David says, so that the world will know that there's a God in Israel and that this God saves. David knows what the Apostle Paul will tell us in Ephesians, that this is a spiritual battle that's being fought. What the writer of 1 Samuel may not have had in mind, but what the gospel writers certainly pick up on and want us to see is that David is not the king that Israel had hoped for. David is not their final king who will usher in God's eternal kingdom. He's flawed and he fails. What the gospel writers want us to see is that David's facing off of Goliath points us ahead to the second David, who, after being anointed, faced off against the powerful Satan. A picture, if you will, of divine might, offering the kingdoms of the world, offering to feed the famished Jesus, offering everything on a silver platter. It'll be easy. He is a representation of, right, the way the world fights, if you will. In contrast, we have the vulnerable Jesus, famished after 40 days of fasting. But Jesus, this second David, resists the temptation to reach out and grab the weapons of his enemy. Instead, Jesus shows us and proclaims to Satan and to us that life is not found in the things of this world, the bread or the kingdom, or even at the call of one who could summon the armies of heaven. Salvation comes through the one who lays down his life out of love and compassion for this world. Friends, the story of David presents two perspectives. And this is where I want to leave us today. Because it prompts a question that I think we need to consider in our own ministry here in where God has called us. And the question is this: when the world looks at the Rubens vase of the church, what do they see? What perspective does the world have on the church? History is one way to answer that, and we've seen the church taking up the weapons of this world in the Crusades, right? In the Inquisition. A little closer to home, as reformers drowned the Anabaptist. A little closer to home, as our cousins in South Africa used theology to prop up apartheid. What about even closer to home? In 2010, the Barna Research Group, they do research on the church in North America. They did research and asked young people at that time, young people who were associated to the church, maybe walked away from the church, but they did not identify themselves as Christians, but they knew Christians and they knew the church. And the question was their view of the church. What do they see when they look at the church? Here's what they said. They said that young people admitted, the researchers said that young people admitted that they had emotional and intellectual barriers go up when it comes to Christians, and they reject Jesus because they themselves had been rejected by Christians. The book goes on to unpack that with greater detail. Summary was this: they saw Christians offering only shallow relationships. They saw Christians talking hypocritically about sin in other people while committing sin themselves. They saw Christians wielding political power in a way that advantaged themselves and did not care for the vulnerable. That's what the world sees. But what if we gave them a new perspective? I'm thinking now of my friend Joanne. It's not her real name. She really is my friend. Joanne gives us, I think, a new perspective. I got to know Joanne. She is a nurse. She's a retired professor of nurses, both undergrad and master's level. I heard her story when she and I were in a Colossian Way small group together on human sexuality. And in that group, all of us were invited to tell our story of God's work in our lives. And Joanne talked about growing up in a Christian home. And she talked about experiencing God's call on her life, and that's why she became a nurse. She wanted to serve and care for people who were vulnerable and hurting. And as it so happened, as she tells the story, God, in his sovereignty and in his plan, called her to be a nurse in the 80s, in the AIDS epidemic. And she talked about how there was fear and there was misinformation, but every day she showed up to work. And she helped heal people's wounds, and she listened to people's stories, and she held people's hands, men's hands, as they succumbed to that evil disease. And Joanne talked in her story about how that process taught her something about God, about his love, about his compassion, and his grace. Now, friends, what would happen if the world saw the church as made up of a bunch of Joannes, they would see a church of compassion, of love for the most vulnerable, for the poor, and for the addict, for the immigrant. What if our neighbors saw our church that way? Then they would see that the Lord is the one who saves by giving up his own life and letting go of the power of this world. Then our neighbors would know that God loves even them. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.